An HOA enforcer tore down the only wheelchair ramp Caleb's disabled son had, without warning, without remorse. Karen Witherspoon called it an unauthorized structure, mocking the boy's needs as a nuisance to her perfect neighborhood. But what she didn't know was that Caleb had a friend in Delta Force, and that night the storm came quietly. And just wait until you hear how justice struck back with military precision. Caleb knew something was wrong the second he turned onto his street. There was no truck in his driveway, no tools scattered near the porch, no bright blue ramp leading down to the sidewalk. Just bare dirt and broken splinters jutting from the edge of the wooden deck, like torn bones where something vital had been ripped away. Mason sat at the top of the steps, still in his pajamas, his wheelchair angled awkwardly behind him. His small hands gripped the arms of the chair like he was trying to understand why the world had suddenly shifted beneath him. His eyes, wide, quiet, too still, met Caleb's as if to ask, "What did I do wrong?" Caleb didn't answer. He couldn't. The breath left his lungs as his gaze dropped to the tire tracks in the grass. Fresh, deep. Whoever had come hadn't even bothered to park properly. They'd reversed right up to the porch, yanked the ramp off its bolts, and hauled it away like trash. The bolts lay scattered like shrapnel. One still spun loosely in the dirt. Then his phone buzzed. A voicemail, time-stamped just 30 minutes earlier. He played it on speaker without thinking. "Your unauthorized structure violates aesthetic continuity. We removed it. Compliance is mandatory." Oh, Karen Witherspoon's voice was clipped, smug, like she was reading from a script she wrote herself. There was no greeting, no explanation, no apology, just the sound of power being used without conscience. Caleb felt a sick heat rise in his chest. The ramp wasn't just a project. It was Mason's freedom. His ability to go to school, to visit the library, to roll out into the yard when the sun came up. Caleb had spent weeks designing it, months battling city permits and zoning boards, and countless weekends building it by hand, board by board, bolt by bolt. And Karen? She knew all of it. She lived 4 houses down. She'd seen Mason on that ramp every morning, waving goodbye as the school bus pulled up. She'd smiled the day it was finished, and now she had torn it down like it was nothing but an eyesore. For a long moment Caleb stood there, rooted to the ground, fists clenched so tightly his nails bit into his palms. He wanted to yell, to demand answers, to rewind time by one cruel morning. But all he could do was cross the lawn, kneel in front of his son, and say, softly, "I'm so sorry, buddy. I'm going to fix this, I promise." Mason didn't say anything. He just nodded slowly, his lip trembling, and turned his face toward the rising sun, waiting once again for someone else to lift him down. And Caleb, he wasn't just going to fix it. He was going to make sure Karen Witherspoon never forgot what she'd taken from them. Karen Witherspoon wasn't elected to the HOA board. She conquered it. The neighborhood joked that her pearls were a permanent fixture, worn even during yard work. But behind the polished smiles and floral cardigans was a woman who treated her title less like a community role and more like a crown. She drove a spotless silver Lexus, always parked diagonally across 2 spaces outside the clubhouse, both of them marked handicapped. When a veteran down the block tried to fly the American flag on his porch, she fined him twice for unauthorized personal messaging. Another neighbor got cited for having a garden hose visible from the sidewalk. And when Karen was made vice president of the HOA, she stood at the spring social, champagne flute in hand, and laughed to a small circle of bored loyalists. "We're finally cleaning out the undesirables. It's about time this neighborhood had standards again." Caleb had tried to keep his head down. He was a single dad raising a disabled son. He didn't have the time or energy for neighborly battles. But once Karen learned who he was, it was like a switch flipped. In just under a month, she filed 6 separate violations against him. One for leaving a trash can visible for longer than 47 minutes after collection. Another for unsightly sidewalk chalk residue after Mason had drawn smiley faces with his cousin. The most absurd. a formal citation for creating a hostile presence by glaring at her during a board meeting Caleb didn't even attend. It would have been laughable. Oh, geez. If not for what happened with the ramp, that wasn't HOA red tape. That was cruelty. And it was personal. Caleb tried calling every board member listed on the HOA website. Half the numbers went to voicemail. The other half were mysteriously disconnected. No one returned his messages. No one showed up, not even a notice on his door. Then came the whispers. Mrs. Rankin, the widow next door, leaned over the fence at dusk and said in a shaky voice, "I saw her nephew's truck, the one with the lawn company logo. They were the ones who took the ramp." Later, Caleb heard from another neighbor, a quiet man who usually kept to himself, that Karen had joked at her Sunday brunch. Maybe the boy needs some tough love, builds character, learning to do things the hard way. That night, Caleb sat alone in the kitchen long after Mason had gone to bed. The house was dark. The silence was thick. He replayed the voicemail again and again, hoping it would sound different the 7th time. But the words never changed, and neither did the smirk he imagined on her face when she said them. Karen had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. This wasn't about bylaws anymore. It wasn't even about him. She had taken something from his son, something essential, and done it with full awareness of the harm. Caleb didn't sleep. He sat by Mason's bed, watching his son breathe softly in the glow of a nightlight shaped like a rocket ship. Every rise and fall of Mason's chest lit a deeper fire in Caleb's own. And somewhere, far from suburbia, under a sky without street lamps, another man stared at a blinking phone screen. A man who hadn't forgotten the debt he owed Caleb. And that man, he didn't sleep either. The message came through encrypted, as it always did. Marcus Hale's eyes scanned the screen mid-drill, his hands still wrapped in fingerless gloves, boots coated in desert dust. The team was halfway through a nighttime simulation in the hills north of Fort Bragg when his personal alert buzzed 3 times. Only 3. Always 3. Ramp gone, Mason stranded, HOA, need quiet storm. No names, no call signs, just enough. But Marcus didn't need context. He already knew. He stared at the words for a beat longer than usual. Then he turned to his team captain, gave a silent nod, and jogged off into the darkness. No explanation offered, none needed. Because when a Delta brother calls in a quiet storm, it isn't a metaphor, it's an operation. Marcus wasn't just Caleb's oldest friend. They'd been raised 2 blocks apart, shared a bunk during basic, and watched each other grow into men shaped by duty and sacrifice. Caleb had once carried Marcus, bleeding, unconscious, through the wreckage of an ambush in Kandahar, refusing evacuation until every man was accounted for. And Mason? Mason was the boy who called Marcus Uncle Hawk and made him a hand-painted mug every Christmas. The boy who never once complained about wheelchairs, surgeries, or not being able to ride a bike like the other kids. So, when Marcus read that Mason had been stranded, his lifeline ripped away by a suburban tyrant in pearls, something in him locked into place. A lever was pulled. A boundary was crossed. That night, 3 black SUVs rolled silently through the winding roads of Briar Glen Estates. No headlights, no idle chatter, just quiet comms and GPS overlays. They weren't armed for combat. This wasn't that kind of fight, but they came prepared with something far more disruptive than weapons. Authority. Karen Witherspoon's elaborate network of doorbell cameras, rendered useless, looping endlessly on a signal jammer slipped into the hedge line. Her motion-detecting floodlights, disabled from the main junction box by a technician with a federal badge and an engineering degree. No noise, no alarms, just motion, precision, justice. Marcus didn't lift a single tool. He didn't have to. By 2 a.m., a brand new ADA-compliant steel ramp was bolted to Caleb's porch, wider, stronger, and reinforced with anti-slip plating. It had railings built to code and lights that illuminated low to the ground, making it easier for Mason to roll down after dark. The crew double-checked every anchor bolt, took photos for federal documentation, and left a note taped neatly to the porch post. This structure complies with federal accessibility law. Tampering is a felony. U.S. Office of Civil Rights Enforcement Division, and at precisely 2:13 a.m., a sharp knock echoed through the grand double doors of Karen Witherspoon's two-story colonial. She answered in a satin robe, pearls still inexplicably around her neck. A team of federal inspectors stood on her doorstep, holding a court order in one hand and a thick packet labeled Americans with Disabilities Act Compliance Violation, Immediate Review. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't ask. They informed. Her mouth opened to protest, but the lead inspector calmly read from the injunction: violations, liability, personal accountability, and the open investigation into intentional obstruction of accessibility for a minor. Karen blinked, speechless. She had ruled the neighborhood like it was her empire, but that night, at 2:13 a.m., the empire cracked, not with explosions, not with threats, but with silence, with paperwork, and with men who knew exactly how to dismantle arrogance without saying a word. And Marcus Hale? He was already gone. No footprints, no farewell, just one message sent to Caleb at 2:14 a.m. Ramp secured. Kids got a runway now. The consequences arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, relentless rhythm, like dominoes falling one after another, neat and irreversible. By noon the next day, Karen Witherspoon had been formally served on her front porch. The man in the suit didn't flinch when she demanded to know what authority he had to interrupt her breakfast. He simply handed her a folder stamped with the seal of the U.S. Department of Justice and said 5 words that landed harder than any raised voice ever could. You've been named in a civil action. The charges were clear: intentional violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, malicious removal of essential accessibility infrastructure, and personal discrimination against a minor. Each one stacked atop the next like bricks in a wall she'd built herself. The very same day, her nephew's landscaping company, whose trucks bore her HOA's crest on the side panels, received a state notice of contract termination. Turns out, using unlicensed labor to demolish a medical ramp without permits doesn't just void insurance. It flags you for state fraud oversight. Karen called a lawyer. 2, actually. The first declined after reading the summary. The second asked if she'd seen the headlines yet, because while she was still trying to figure out how this could happen to her, the internet was already 10 steps ahead. A local photographer had taken a photo that morning, Mason beaming as he rolled down the brand new ramp, his hands lifted high like wings, his wheels catching the early sun. Caleb stood behind him, a quiet figure on the porch, arms crossed, not angry anymore, just watching. Steady, present. The caption beneath the viral tweet read, "HOA destroyed this child's wheelchair ramp. Delta Force rebuilt it before sunrise." Within hours, it had been picked up by regional outlets. By sunset, national media had the full story. Hashtags trended. Disability advocates mobilized. A junior senator from Maryland issued a public statement praising the anonymous veterans involved, stating, "This isn't just an act of service, it's a blueprint for what solidarity looks like." Karen's name trended for the wrong reasons. Her past board decisions were dredged up. Dozens of homeowners came forward with stories of fines, threats, and forced removals. One even produced a voice recording from a board meeting where Karen openly admitted, "A ramp like that lowers property value, it sends the wrong message." That clip alone sealed her fate. Her realtor dropped her. Her insurance provider declined renewal. The HOA board quietly removed her name from their website and voted in a new interim president, a retired school principal with a granddaughter in a wheelchair. And the Lexus? Towed from the clubhouse parking lot after someone finally reported the expired handicapped tag she'd been using for over a year. But the real moment, the one Caleb would remember, wasn't on the news or online. It was Friday morning. The sun had just started warming the sidewalk. Mason was already at the top of the ramp, face full of focus. Caleb stood nearby, coffee in hand, pretending not to watch too closely. And then Mason shouted, 3, 2, 1! He pushed forward with all his strength. The wheels picked up speed, the wind caught in his hair, and for a second, Mason wasn't rolling. He was flying. Arms up, laughing. "It's like a racetrack!" Caleb's chest tightened, not with anger this time, but with something cleaner. Pride, relief, maybe even peace. He didn't smile often. Life had trained that out of him a long time ago. But that morning, he smiled like a man who knew two things for certain. His son was free, and justice had arrived exactly on time. Karen moved out 2 months later. A quiet sale, no announcement, no farewell barbecue. The neighbors didn't ask questions. They didn't offer help. And when the moving truck finally pulled away from Briar Glen Estates, nobody waved goodbye.